Whenever you're ready, it's fine.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Helen Miller. I am an Assistant Governance Relations at GRI. Welcome to this meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, known by its acronym, the GSSB, held on 29th of June 2017. This virtual meeting is being hosted from the GRI Secretariat Office in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Please note that all public GSSB meetings are being recorded, and you can find the audio recording on the GSSB website, along with high-level summaries of previous GSSB meetings. Present from the GRI Secretariat today are Bastian Buck, Director Standards Division, Chelsea Reinhardt, Deputy Director Standards Division, Laura Espinach, Manager Standards, and Pamela Carpio, Senior Coordinator Governance Relations. We will now start with a roll call. Attila Yerlikaya. Attila Yerlikaya, are you present? Daniel Tailang.
Yes, I'm present. Good morning.
Evan Harvey.
Present. Hello.
Jürgen Buxbaum.
I'm present. Hello.
Ken Swift.
I'm present.
Kirsten Margrethe Hovey.
Present.
Michelle Wascher.
Present.
Nankumar Vadakipat.
Good afternoon. Present.
Robin Leeson.
Yes, present.
Stian Vandrach.
Good afternoon, present.
And Judy Kuszewski, GSSB Chair.
Yes, I'm here. Hello, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. We would like to note that GSSB members Julia Wilson, Dwight Justice, Daniel Ingram, and Sulema Pioli send their apologies to this meeting. I will now hand to the Chair, Judy Kuszewski, to open the meeting.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you, everybody, for joining us on the line. So if anyone has any questions about it or anything to add to the agenda, it would be great if you could identify that now. Okay, hearing none, we'd like to approve the summary of the 24th of May GSSB meeting, which was also sent around. I don't know if the Secretariat has received comments from anyone already on this meeting summary, but maybe if they have, perhaps you could identify them. And if not, I would like to open it up to the GSSB members to raise any edits and then eventually to approve this summary, please.
No comments, Judy, from the Secretariat.
Okay. GSSB members, are there any comments, edits, questions that you would like to raise with respect to the 24th of May meeting summary?
No.
Nope.
Okay, if there are no objections, then I think we can assume that this is accepted and considered final now. Thank you very much for that. So returning to our agenda, our next item of business, we have a 40-minute session now to take a look at the rough draft of the revised GRI 303 Water and Effluents, followed by a second 40-minute block to do the same thing for the rough draft Occupational Health and Safety GRI 403. I believe this is where the slides come into play. I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea to walk us through this document. Chelsea?
Thank you, Judy. So thank you, board members. Our aim of this session is to go through the rough draft that you received almost 2 weeks ago of the revised GRI 303 Water and Effluents, and to give really ample time for the GSSB to raise any questions or concerns that you have about the draft as it stands now, because the next draft that you will see, we are hoping to get out to you on the 5th of July, and that will be the draft which is for approval for the public comment period. So I will go through a set of the most recent changes in the draft standard based on the latest project working group calls, as well as based on GSSB comments received. So that has shifted a little bit already since the version that you have, based on comments we received via email from the GSSB, and also on the discussion that we had with the project working group on Monday of this week. And then we will have time, over half an hour, to discuss any further comments, questions, or concerns from you. So I'll very quickly run through key changes from the existing GRI 303 Water and GRI 306 Effluents and Waste standard. And I'm not going to go into too much detail because these are outlined as well on pages 2 to 3 of item 02, and we are taking those papers as read. But first, the most significant change is that you'll notice the effluents and discharge content is now incorporated into GRI 303. In the original terms of reference for this working group, they were asked to make a decision on whether or not they wanted to bring that content in with the water standard, and they were absolutely unanimous in the fact that they did want to see that merge together. You also will see now greater emphasis on water-stressed areas due to the local nature of water, and that's bringing us in line with other reporting frameworks and instruments, as well as with advances in sort of water measurement and assessment in this area. There is now a much greater focus on understanding not only your overall water withdrawal, but actually how that withdrawal and consumption is affecting water-stressed areas. We are now asking for water consumption along with withdrawals, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on, and that's from an impact perspective a better metric, because that is actually measuring the water that is consumed, not only water which is withdrawn and then eventually discharged back into the water system. We have added in new specific management approach content related to water and effluents. So following the new structure of the standards, where we have specific elements related to applying the management approach standard, we have some additional requirements, recommendations, and guidance there, which is specific to how organizations should be managing their water and discharge impacts. We also have a recommendation to report withdrawals and consumption by facility. This is information that particularly the investor community would like to see, and that our leading content experts would also like to see companies start to be measuring and managing, but that level of detail is not possible for all companies to be reporting, and therefore it's sitting as a recommendation now. And last, we have added in a new specific disclosure on water impacts in the supply chain and related to products and services. So this is not designed to replace the overall requirements in GRI 103 management approach about describing where the impacts occur, but it's designed to provide more focus specifically for water. For many companies, their greatest water impacts will actually be particularly in the supply chain. So a quick summary of comments received from the GSSB. We heard from 4, actually now 5 of you offline via email with comments ahead of our working group meeting on the 26th of June. So thank you very much. We know that was a tight turnaround, but it did give us time to discuss your comments with the project working group. We have responded to all of the GSSB comments raised individually back to GSSB members, but if you haven't felt something has been adequately discussed, or you do want to bring it up again with a full GSSB, we do have time for that on this call. Some of the main points that the GSSB raised included whether reporting impacts in the supply chain or for products and services would be feasible for large companies. We have adjusted the wording there to make it more clear that that's intended to be really only where impacts are material in the supply chain or for products and services. We had some questions about whether our definition of water stressed is clear and credible. We have now added some additional guidance in there and brought in the definition of water stressed together with the indicators around defining water stressed areas. We had a question about whether water efficiency metrics or the percentage of production in water stressed areas should also be included as disclosures in this standard. And those were 2 points that we addressed again and reconfirmed with the project working group on our call on Monday. There was a request for more guidance on defining water quality categories. We now have additional guidance around water quality categories. And there was a question about confirming whether or not water consumption would be feasible to report. And for that one, we have brought in some additional calculation methodology to help simplify that for companies. So just a quick run through of changes that were made that are already going to look a bit different than the draft you have. Based on the discussion with the project working group on Monday, we have now adjusted the requirements around discharges. Previously, we had a requirement to report discharges by level of treatment, and that was intended to be a good proxy that would be easier for more companies to report than trying to report by level of quality. However, there are concerns raised that some companies actually do have quality information on their discharges, but wouldn't have level of treatment or would find that very hard to put together. So we now have an option that companies have to report discharges either by level of treatment or level of quality. And we have additionally brought in extra guidance around what those quality categories could look like. So there's no universal standard for discharge quality, but we have brought in some examples, and there is a requirement that they define how they have set those quality categories. We've also added additional guidance, as I mentioned before, on how to calculate water consumption. So actually, based on the total withdrawal and discharge figures, companies should be able to come up with a consumption figure. We've also updated the guidance table, so you'll notice in this standard what we have started to do is to provide example tables and how that information could actually be reported, and that's intended to be not a prescriptive format, but we've made it very clear that this is one example of how information could be reported. And we have now brought together into one table the withdrawals, consumption, and discharge. We've also brought in as well what is currently a recommendation around reporting the percentage of total water withdrawals, which is recycled or reused, and that has now been incorporated into the same table as well. Since these slides were put together yesterday, we've made one further modification to the table based on working group feedback. We've now separated out the quality elements from this table, and we'll have a separate table which looks at reporting withdrawals and discharges by quality, and that's because we don't actually require a breakdown of quality by sources or destinations. But the advantage of this table, and what I think the working group is quite pleased with, is that it shows a kind of overall water balance picture. So for a company, you can follow the impacts from withdrawal into consumption and into discharge from the left to the right. We've now also aligned the sources and destinations so that you can actually track what's happening to water from specific sources as it goes through the organization's use. We had one dissenting view from the working group, which I wanted to call to your attention. They've worked through lots of dissenting points over the last several months, so we're really quite pleased with the group dynamic and the effort that people have put into finding good compromise solutions. But we had one concern raised about our definition of water consumption. Right now, the definition that we're using is aligned with the definitions from CDP, the CEO Water Mandate, also the Series Aqua Gauge, and the Alliance for Water Stewardship, and it focuses on water consumption being the use of water that is not returned to its original source, with a series of examples about what that might include. Most project working group members are very happy with this current definition. There was one concern that for mining companies, this may lead to inaccurate reporting, because for mining companies, there's often water extracted from the process of dewatering the ore, which is high quality and is returned to the local water environment, but not to its original source. So the crux of this issue really is about if water is withdrawn and returned to a different destination, but not its original source, should that be counted as consumption? The experts, the content area experts in the group feel that if you're taking water out of one source and returning it to a different source, there is actually an impact on the water environment, and they would want to see that counted as consumption. What we have suggested as a compromise, and this is we're still waiting to work through with a couple of working group members, is that we keep this definition of consumption, which is aligned with most other reporting frameworks and industry instruments, but that we would allow companies to provide a note of explanation if, for example, they do have a high percentage of water which is being withdrawn and returned to a different destination that would be counted within their consumption figures. So that is how we're proposing to address this, and we will keep you updated as we move into the next GSSB discussion in July. So that brings us to the end of my sort of overview. We wanted to make sure that we have adequate time for discussion. So at this point, Judy, I would turn it over to the GSSB members to raise any other points of discussion or questions that they'd like to bring up at this point.
Thank you, Chelsea. I have a first request to comment from Michel Wacher, followed by Kristen and Daniel Tayan. So Michel, please go ahead.
Yes, I confirm the issue about consumption when water is returned to a different area where it was taken. We specifically have the case we use a lot. We use estuary seawater, but sometimes we return fresh water into estuary water and seawater. And so if I look at our own figures, we have input of estuary seawater, which is 74 million cubic meters, but the output is 109. So obviously there is fresh water that is returned there, and it may need to be more detailed or addressed. Second question, we also mentioned in our reporting the part of water which is recycled, which is a lot. And I was wondering if that is an information that should be mentioned also.
Okay. Judy, do you want me to respond to those points?
Yes, sorry, I was just trying to turn my mute button off there. Yes, please, Chelsea, if you have a response to those,
sure.
Please go ahead.
So on the first one, on consumption from different sources, we're not at the moment requiring consumption by source or by destination. So it's really just looking at what we're asking for is consumption from water-stressed and non-water-stressed areas, but that's a total figure. So there is no need to break that down by source or by destination. So your water that's being withdrawn from one place and released or discharged into a different location would be captured in that overall figure. But I'm very happy to take that offline as well if you have specific suggestions on guidance we can provide. On the point about recycled water, right now it is a recommendation to also report the total percentage of water withdrawals, which is reused or recycled. That was a mandatory disclosure in the previous version of the standard, and the working group discussed this multiple times and decided that from an impact perspective, actually, your greatest impact really is on your water consumption and the quality of your discharges, and particularly looking at impacts in water-stressed areas. And that recycling and reuse, although important as a management approach, doesn't actually necessarily change your overall impact. So you can recycle more, but still be using more water or more water from sensitive locations. So we do expect companies to be reporting this, particularly if they are recycling a large percentage of their water, but they didn't think that that made the criteria for most critical required information.
Okay, I agree. I agree for impact. I still think that from a management practice, it's important. And just to indicate, in our case, the percentage of recycled water is 150% our intake.
Okay, yep.
So it's more than 100%.
Okay. So your position is that you would like to see that as a mandatory disclosure?
Well, not especially, but certainly in our case, we would continue to put it because it's an indication of how close we're moving to closed loops everywhere.
Okay, yes.
So I think it's a relevant information, even from an impact point of view. It's an indication of how much an organization has already reduced their impact compared to the total impact they could have.
Yes, yep, that's fair. Okay.
All right, Kirsten Hofi, would you like to make a comment?
Thank you. This is also about water consumption, and unfortunately I did not fully catch what Chelsea said about how it could be arranged for instance, mining companies. But I'd just like to mention how we are doing this at several plants. They are situated at the coast, and the river is running by, and 100 meters before the river runs into the fjord, we take out cooling water, use it for cooling, and then return it into the fjord. According to this definition, that would be water consumption, because we do not return it to the source. But that would have been 100 meters in the river before it then goes into the fjord. So it seems to be a pretty rigorous way to claim that this is water consumption. In other cases, we are using rainwater, and how should that be accounted for? We cannot put it back into the sky.
So I think, Kirsten, to respond to that, I mean, that the sense that we're getting in the project working group is that there is not a lot of, I mean, GRI has never asked for this metric before, and we are at the moment with the definitions aligned with sort of the latest definitions and clarifications that have come out from some of these leading groups, such as the CEO Water Mandate, the Pacific Institute, WWF, and others. I think where in practice what we are likely looking at is at the moment we have a definition which is quite clear about if water is not returned to its original source, then it would be counted as your consumption, and that's intended to be sort of, I think, overly protective in that actually people who are pulling water from one source where it's not a particularly sensitive water body and discharging it into a sensitive location would still need to be counting that. But in practice, the calculation methodology which is being recommended for us to include, particularly for sort of new companies that have never looked at this before, would be a much more straightforward total figure, which looks at basically consumption being the difference between your total withdrawals and your discharges. And so there would be significantly less granularity in that type of calculation than in looking at each individual withdrawal and discharge by source. And I believe at the moment the working group is quite content with having reached that sort of compromise, but we certainly could also bring in the guidance I mentioned earlier that would give companies the ability to explain, for example, if 10% of their consumption figure was actually water which is being pulled from one source, not used and released into another nearby source.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Chelsea.
I'm not really sure that clarifies it to me. And another issue here is that talking about water consumption in an area where water is abundant is of much less interest than when we're talking about water-stressed areas, where I believe we should focus on such issues as water consumption. Thank you.
Okay, there's also been a comment in the chat function from Michel Washer supporting Kirsten's point with his own example from their situation. Daniel Tayon, do you have a few questions?
Yeah, just a couple of questions and a few comments on this water issue. I tend to think that taking water from one source and putting it in another is not necessarily a good thing, even if you do nothing to the water. Obviously, if you're taking it from a stressed area, you're impacting that area, and if you're adding water to an area and maybe flooding an area or otherwise, that could be an issue. So I tend to like the definition that is there already. One question I had regarding that definition and the dissenting view of the member of the working group is whether or not they had a proposed alternative. I didn't hear that from the comments. Maybe I missed it. So that's just one comment. Another question I had in the document, there is on line 21, there's a mention that on the issue of water discharge, or for example, the example given is agricultural discharge such as runoff, that it was too technical to report. I just wanted to know a little bit more about that. And just to give an example here, I live in Florida, and over the last year we've had enormous issues with agricultural runoff, contaminating water and really putting at risk the freshwater resources for the community and really impacting the general environment and the Everglades in particular. So I just wanted to know, what was behind that comment of it being too technical to report. Another question I had was with regards to the right to water and whether that came up at all in the discussions, and whether or not is specifically and importantly in the discussion of water impacts, whether or not to mention in recommendations or in guidance the importance of following the UN framework or approach to the human right to water. I think those were my only comments. Thank you.
Okay,
Chelsea.
can try and address those in turn. So first, about the definition of consumption and the dissenting views. Right now, we did quite a lot of, and Anna and Sharon, Anna is on leave this month, which is why I'm presenting this on her behalf. They did quite a lot of work in looking at how our definitions and terminology compares with other reporting frameworks or water measurement or management instruments out there, like the Alliance for Water Stewardship Standard, the CEO Water Mandate documents, CDP, Ceres Aquagauge, WWF, and others. Right now, on the water consumption, we are aligned with the majority of instruments or frameworks. ICMM, from where this comment came in the working group, has their own definition of water consumption, which is specific to the mining and metals industry. And this is one of the challenges that we are going to face as we continue to develop sort of universal disclosures across all industries, is that there are going to be sectors, and this is similar to your point around agricultural runoff as well, that think we haven't adequately covered their particular impacts in these kind of 4 universal disclosures on water and effluents. So I think here, I from a project management perspective, not being a technical water expert, think we are probably in the right place with this definition and alignment, providing that we've also now brought in some more simplified calculation guidance on water consumption and the option for companies to explain any sort of exceptional circumstances. I think, Daniel, your point about how water taken from one source returned to a different source is still impactful. It is very much in line with the discussion we had with the working group on Monday. But they are looking at that from a sort of content expert perspective. On the runoff question, that similarly, this was believed to be maybe too technical is not the right word, but too industry specific to report as a separate metric or disclosure. So the consensus was that sort of overall agricultural runoff and discharge can still be treated within the management approach. And we might consider providing some additional guidance there, but that actually developing specific disclosures around agricultural runoff was something that would not be applicable in a sort of universal standard. And on the right to water, that has been incorporated under the sort of management approach elements, so particularly looking at the shared use of water and how the organization is working with others to manage water as a shared resource, and there's also guidance in there around the human right to water. We haven't been more specific with that, and the working group felt that this is really hard to put quantitative indicators against this, but if you have suggestions, certainly I think we'd be very open to bring those back to the working group.
Okay, Kirsten Hoopy is raising her hand again. Kirsten?
Thank you, Judy. My main concern here is related to how water consumption will be understood for those reading the reports. I do agree that there is some sort of an impact when we do return the water to another place than the source we took it from. But even if we take it back to the source where we took it from, there would also be an impact. There is an impact related to all industrial activity, but we do need to focus on what is really important here, what is really material. And when we do discharge it out in the fjord 100 meters later than it would be discharged into the fjord anyway in a water abundant area, that is of no big concern, no big impact to the environment. The impact would have been in other things, if any. So I think it's more important that we try to find out if returning it to another body will do significant impact or not. That is where it should be defined, and not automatically being defined by putting it back to an other recipient than where it was withdrawn. Thank you.
Okay, I can give you a quick response to that, but that's probably a point that I need to bring back to the working group. I mean, I think it will be very difficult to craft a disclosure that allows companies to define their water consumption based on where they think there's likely to be an impact on returning to original source versus a different source. I think that will create more subjectivity than the working group is likely to be comfortable with. But I think these are very valid concerns, and they are things that came up as well in the working group discussion that we can certainly represent back to them. The definitions of source that are included, that are in the standard, are not particularly specific. So I do think, and this is something we can reconfirm with the group, that companies will inevitably have some subjectivity in figuring out whether 100 meters down the same river is actually the same source. So I think there will be shades of gray in this, but I think that very much in terms of being aligned with other instruments, which is one of the overall mandates of this working group process, we would need to stick with consumption according to one of these definitions to stay aligned with other metrics. But I have noted down those points to be able to bring them back, Houston, and they're certainly very valid.
Thanks, Chelsea. Yes, I think it's certainly valid and helpful for us as the GSSB to identify where we have questions and ask the working group to clarify their recommendations and their position on many of these matters. Daniel has just sent a relatively long comment in the chat function. Daniel, would you like to actually share it in the meeting, or would you like me to read it out?
No, it's not necessary, and I mentioned that in my comment. I leave it to the Secretariat to register the comment, and as final editing occurs, to consider them. That's all.
Okay. So just for the record, there are a couple of comments here that have to do, first of all, with runoff, agricultural runoff, and with right to water. And the request is simply that the Secretariat take note of those, and the Standards Division respond in turn, in kind, when the time comes. Yeah.
Judy, can I just make one request? I think, Daniel, for comments like that, we're very happy to bring this back to the working group. Given the place where we're at in terms of the project timing, if you're able to come up with specific suggestions for us on the kind of the section or the wording that you would like to see represented in the standard, that will make our job much more efficient, and we'll be able to facilitate that process of potentially including changes much better. So if you have a clear vision of how you'd like to see those issues potentially incorporated that we can bring to the working group, that would be very useful. Otherwise, we are likely to have the same discussion we had previously on those points.
Yeah, just to respond to that, I think on the first point, that's probably not possible because it would be too in-depth. On the second, it would just be mentioning the UN Human Right to Water as a framework for impact. And I can provide more thoughts on that if you need them.
That would be excellent. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a good point, Chelsea. We are, at a fairly tight period of our process here, and as members will be well aware, there isn't a lot of slack built into the timing of any of these projects. So at this stage, it would be exceedingly welcome and helpful for the Standards Division if you have specific recommendations that you would like to send in offline. That would be most helpful at this stage. Are there other questions or comments? I see a couple of people might be writing some notes in the chat function at the moment. If there is anything further that anybody would like to introduce into the discussion at this point, that would be very welcome. Hearing none, Chelsea, have you got what you needed from the GSS?
Sorry, I tried to write raising hand, Kirsten again.
Yes, please, Kirsten.
Yeah. The challenge of water is that it is a regional or even a local resource, but it is very often treated by analysts like if it was, or others like if it was a global resource. And the water we are using, or the water we are withdrawing, 1% is in water-stressed areas. The rest is in areas where the access to water is abundant. And when we talk about water consumption, that's seems to be very sensitive information, and it is actually also in reality very wrong in many areas in the world to talk about water consumption in this context. I tried to write it down, but I didn't have time for it. So I hope you can just make a note on that too, Chelsea.
Sorry, Kirsten, what are you suggesting as a change? I'm not quite sure I captured that.
Not having the same approach to water reporting wherever you are in the world. It's not a global resource, and global approach seems quite meaningless in many cases.
Okay. So you don't think we've gone far enough by bringing in the breakdowns by water stressed areas for consumption and withdrawals?
Exactly.
So sorry, you don't think we've gone far enough with that? Right now we do require a breakdown. Are you saying that? Are you supporting that, or saying that that's not quite enough?
I'm definitely supporting a breakdown based on access to water in the area, but then I also believe that some of the more detailed reporting should then apply for water stressed areas and not as a general requirement.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much. Chelsea, are you satisfied with the conversation? Is there anything that you were expecting from the GSSB that we haven't covered at the moment?
Judy, I never know what to expect from the GSSB. No, I think that's fine. I would say if you reflect on it, if you haven't had time to read the standard through in detail, and you do after the call, and can come back to probably myself directly with any further comments, we'd much rather hear these points now and be able to hopefully work through them ahead of the July timeframe. So I think we're set at the moment, but any other comments can certainly come through by email.
Chelsea, would you like to clarify for the Standards Board a specific deadline for any comments on this draft that you've sent around, so that you don't get them when you can't deal with them?
Ideally last week, but failing that, tomorrow.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, well, I think, unless there is a very last final comment on this, I think we are able to move on to the Occupational Health and Safety Working Group rough draft, which I believe will be presented by Laura. Laura, would you like to lead us through the slides?
Sure, thank you, Judy, and hello, everyone. So next up is occupational health and safety, and that is item 03. As with water, the objective of this session is to... Apologies, we're having some echo here in the room. Please bear with us for a moment. I think there might be some of you who are not muted. Can I please ask you to all mute yourselves? Thank you very much. So, as I was...
Yeah, GSSB members, if I could just a little reminder that if you are not speaking, would you kindly put your microphones on mute? And of course, obviously, if you want to make a comment, make sure you unmute yourself so that we don't talk over each other. Thank you very much. I hope that resolves it, Laura.
Thank you, Judy. So as I was saying, the objective of this session, as with water, is to present the recent changes to the draft that you have seen based on both input from the working group and input from the GSSB, and to discuss any further comments, questions, or concerns with the GSSB today. As we said earlier, this is the opportunity now to raise any fundamental content issues with this draft so that we can work on this offline in the coming days before we submit the public comment draft for your approval next week. So first, just a quick overview of changes to the existing GRI 403. We have a lot of content to cover for this session. So what I would suggest is that I just highlight a few examples of key changes that you can expect, and that I refer you back to pages 2 and 3 of item 03, where you can find the full list of changes compared to the existing standard. And I'm always happy to answer any questions or clarify anything when we open for discussion. So to give you just a few examples, in the latest draft, you will see a greater emphasis on the use of management systems, and in particular, looking at the processes for identifying hazards and assessing and controlling risks, and processes for worker participation, consultation, information, and training. You will also see a greater emphasis on looking at impacts on workers, and that is in line with the clarification that we introduced last year in the GRI standards. So you will see that measures around the loss of productivity or lost time, such as the lost day rate or the absentee rate, have now been taken out of the draft. And finally, you will also see new content looking beyond traditional occupational health and safety, and focusing more on non-work related factors that affect workers' health and what companies are doing to address that. So with that, let's go and have a look at the comments that we have received from the GSSB on item 03. We have received comments from 5 members and from one additional one just before the meeting. So thank you very much for all of your input. We were able to discuss some of these issues with the working group last week, and other comments we have been able to address them offline with individual members. Among the main points raised included the disclosure on worker health promotion that I just mentioned. This is a new element introduced in the standard, looking beyond the traditional field of occupational health and safety. And we got a comment from one GSSB member to clearly separate this content out from the main OH&S responsibilities of a company, and to preferably move this out of the standard entirely and into a separate GRI standard. Other comments included reporting the name of the standard used for the management system if a recognized standard is used, and to review the requirement to report on certification of the management system, since the focus should not be on the certificate itself, but on a good process for external verification. The first point here we're bringing for discussion today with the full GSSB, and the other 2 points have been addressed, and we will touch upon those in a moment. More comments included to clarify the requirement to report the percentage of workers covered by formal committees. It wasn't clear exactly what kind of information was being requested. We have now clarified that in the standard. Another comment related to the fact that we are requesting both the rate and the number of work-related injuries, and that we should be requiring one or the other, but not both. We are proposing to keep both the rate and the number in the draft based on working group discussions, but we have developed some guidance explaining the value of why reporting both the rate and the number is useful for the report reader. There was another comment on the feasibility of reporting work-related illnesses for workers who are not employees. This point was also discussed by the working group in several occasions. And what they ended up with is that they recognize the fact that it is challenging to obtain this data for workers who are not employees, and that in many cases the information will not be of the same quality as for employees, but that should not become an excuse not to report this data. And that by requiring this information, it will push companies to make better efforts to collect this data in the future. Also, one change to address this point is that in the next iteration of the draft, which you will see next week, each disclosure now has a requirement for the company to explain whether any workers have been excluded from the data and why. So there's always a possibility for the company to explain if it has not been possible to obtain this data. There were also a few comments asking to clarify certain elements in the standard, for example, the concepts of high potential incidents, significant hazards, severe, etc. We have now added additional guidance, definitions, and examples in the standard, and you will be able to see that in the next iteration of the draft. And finally, also a comment to reduce the amount of management approach guidance. I think in the draft that we circulated to you, we had about 2 pages of management approach guidance. We've now gone back to that, tried to consolidate guidance in places and to reduce any guidance that is not relevant or necessary to adequately report on the management approach requirements. So you will see that has been reduced to the extent that we were able to do that. Finally, we got additional comments from one GSSB member ahead of the call. Many of those comments are easy for us to work offline, but there was one comment in particular that we wanted to bring to your attention, and that was a suggestion to keep the lost day rate and the absentee rate. Not as requirements, but as recommendations for companies, since those are common elements of a management system and it's information that companies already have readily available. From the standards division perspective, what we would propose is that we do not introduce this at this stage, unless, of course, there is general agreement within the GSSB that we should be doing that. And the reason for that is that we already require a lot of detailed information on work-related injury and illness, and also given the fact that we want to move away from productivity-related measures and to focus more on the impacts on workers. And there's a lot of literature available explaining how some injuries and illnesses do not result in any lost time, but are still quite significant for workers in terms of their health and safety. So with that, let's go and have a look at the key changes that we have made to the draft based on GSSB and working group input. We will be focusing mainly on changes to requirements, but as I said, there's many more changes that we have done at the recommendations and guidance level, which you will be able to see next week. So on occupational health and safety management systems, we have made 2 key changes based on GSSB input. First is that we are requiring the name of the standard used for the management system, if a standard has been used for that purpose. And on the item on certification of the management systems, now organizations can either report on the use of certification or on the use of external audit. On formal committees, we have replaced the percentage of workers represented by those committees by a narrative requirement within the management approach. So we have taken that disclosure and quantitative requirement entirely, and that has been replaced by a narrative requirement in management approach, which focuses more on the mandate of the committee and how it fulfills that mandate, which the working group thought would be more meaningful information to disclose. Then on work-related injury and illness data, we have made 3 key changes. The first change is that we now ask for data to be disaggregated by employees and workers who are not employees. And that is just to reveal whether the company is outsourcing dangerous work. We are now requiring the fatal work-related illnesses to be reported separately. Previously, that was included within the overall number of work-related illnesses. And finally, we are now being more prescriptive about the formula that should be used to calculate the injury rates. And we have aligned the methodology with the ILO, which uses a rate per 1 million hours worked. Previously, we were using 200,000 hours worked, which was the methodology used by the US OSHA administration. But after some discussion with the working group, we decided to align this with the ILO. And that's also consistent with other reporting frameworks, such as Roveco-SAM. On significant hazards, we have made 2 key changes. The first is that we no longer require the number of workers exposed to each hazard. That's just now our recommendation, and that's based on feedback that this information is quite challenging to put together, especially for large chemical companies, and that the effort required to put together this information is not balanced with the meaning of the data that is being provided. And we have also adjusted wording slightly for significant hazards. We're now talking about hazards that pose significant risks, and that's just to clarify that we're focusing mainly on uncontrolled hazards which pose a significant risk for workers. On the scope of workers covered by GRI 403, the scope itself remains the same, but we have made some small editorial changes, and we have developed new definitions and examples. So first, you will see that the scope of workers will be now prominently explained at the beginning of the standard. Previously, we had this in the background context section, and now we have taken this out and put it up front just before the section on management approach disclosures, and is also included within a box, so it clearly stands out. In addition to that, we are now saying just worker all throughout the standard. Previously, we were using workers whose work or workplace is controlled by the organization. But now, because we have much more content in the standard, it became very difficult for us to use the full sentence every time, especially in the management approach section, where we have multiple short clauses following one another. So we are now just saying worker everywhere for simplicity, and then linking that term worker back to the explanation that you find at the beginning of the standard. And we hope that that will make the standard much easier to read and to comprehend. We have also developed new definitions for full and shared control of the work and/or the workplace, and we have developed examples of situations for where there is full and shared control, and you will be able to find those in the glossary. And also, as mentioned earlier, all disclosures now require the company to explain whether any workers have been excluded and why. So again, acknowledging that it may be difficult to report data for workers who are not employees and for workers for whom there is shared control but not full control, and give it an opportunity to the company to explain where data has not been able to be obtained. And finally, the last changes concern the worker health promotion disclosure, which we are bringing up for discussion with you today. This is arguably one of the most challenging elements that we had to deal with as part of this process. But after much discussion within the working group, we feel that we have been able to reach a compromise that most members are able to support. So after discussion with the working group, we made 4 key changes to the disclosure compared to the draft that you received 2 weeks ago. The first change, and that was a unanimous change, was to clearly separate work and workplace-related hazards from this disclosure, since those contents would be addressed earlier in the standard when we look at work and workplace-related hazards, and that should be clearly separate from anything that has to do with individual lifestyle choices of workers and what the company is doing to help address those. So you will see that all references to workplace stress, violence, work-life balance, bullying, etc., all of that has now been taken out from this disclosure, and what we're left with is just a description of any voluntary programs that the company has put in place for workers to address major health risks that are not work-related, but related to individual lifestyle choices. And then the percentage of workers that have access to those programs. Then we have made 3 other changes or clarifications within guidance. The first one is to clarify that these programs should not be a substitute for effective management systems that prevent workplace hazards and risks, and that the primary focus and responsibility of companies should be to protect workers from work-related injury and illness. And only once that is accomplished, a company can then go ahead and offer such voluntary programs. The second clarification in guidance is that these programs should respect workers' right to privacy, and here we're referencing the relevant ILO instrument, and that these programs should not become criteria for employment. And finally, we have also clarified that this disclosure is only looking at whether the programs are available, and that it is not looking at whether workers actually participate in them, and is not either asking for any worker health data, such as data on blood pressure, BMI, or anything like that. So it's just really about whether those programs are available for workers on a voluntary basis. So the working group is happy that by making these changes, we can go ahead and put this out for your approval and subsequent public comment. But they have now until next Monday, the 3rd of July, to document any dissenting views for us to bring to your attention. But yeah, tentatively, they have agreed to this, and we already got confirmation yesterday from both one labor representative and one business representative that they support the disclosure as it currently stands. Now, we have received feedback on this disclosure from 2 GSSB members who are not able to join the meeting today, so I want to briefly represent those comments to you on their behalf. The first set of comments are from Dwight Justice. He is suggesting 2 changes to the disclosure, which you see within square brackets on the screen. The first suggestion is to clarify more prominently within the requirement itself that this is about non-work-related health risks. And the second comment to clarify that in addition to employment criteria, this program should not be used for things like promotion, compensation, or any other favorable treatments towards workers. And the comment from Sulema Pioli is that she is supportive of the disclosure. So what we would like to do today is to entertain a discussion with you as to whether there is general support to go ahead with the disclosure and to put it up for public comment, or whether any changes would be needed to the disclosure. Before I turn it over to you, Judy, I just wanted to quickly invite Kirsten and Stian, who have been the sponsors for this process, and they have been following the discussions very closely, just to say a few words on how they have seen the process, the outcome, and anything that they would like to add to the explanation we've given today, and in particular with this disclosure we're looking at now on worker health promotion.
Thanks, Laura. Kirsten or Stian, would you like to say anything at this point to Laura's request?
I can start, if that's okay to you, Stian.
Sure, go ahead.
I think it has been a very good process, very competent working group, an excellent facilitation from the standards department side. There are still a few issues I'm a bit worried about in the draft we now have. At the same time, there are also several improvements that I highly support. When it comes to the last part of the disclosure, the current up now, there have been some discussion whether this should only be a recommendation or if it should be a reporting requirement. My understanding from the following the in-person meeting we had in Amsterdam was that it should be a recommendation, but it is now a reporting requirement. I must admit personally, I'm happy with both alternatives, but I'm just mentioning it. Anything you would like to add, Stian?
I can only echo what Kirsten said. It was and is a highly professional and experienced public working group from all over the world, very interactive, and all the discussions were frank, open, and at one point on the worker health promotion, we were worried about what the outcome will be, but they managed to resolve it within the meeting, and yeah, I fully support the outcome as we've seen it today. And again, the standards division, you know, the effectiveness of pulling together all the feedback and writing up everything, well done on that. Thanks a lot, Judy.
Thank you both, Kirsten and Stian and Laura. Laura, are you now asking for the GSSB to share their comments and questions at this point?
Yes.
Okay.
What I would propose is that we focus on this disclosure now, and then we can open up for comments on any other sections of the standard.
All right, fine. So first of all, then, the worker health promotion discussion that we've just been having. Are there any comments and questions and feedback that the GSSB members would like to share on this?
It's Michel Washer here. No.
Please, Michel.
No particular comment here, except that this is precisely one thing that we try to develop in the company. So, in my opinion, yes, it's an adequate disclosure.
Kirsten, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, I'm now talking on as an ordinary GSSB member and not as the sponsor of the working group only. I have a few, as I mentioned, still have a few concerns. The first is related to the formal management employee committees. I think it's a very good solution that has now been given by making it a qualitative requirement only. Still, I do believe that there is a need of a definition of such committees, because we tried to collect the information last year, and we saw that depending on which culture we were in, it was difficult to understand what we were really asking for. And still, the draft standard does not really help me in that area. when it comes to number or rate, or both for injuries, I still support that it should be enough to report one of them. But no big issue. If you have to report either of them, you have to have both figures. So it shouldn't be a big issue. It's more about that it seems to be a bit unnecessary. Then disclosure 403.4, work-related illnesses. I still mean that the requirement of reporting it also for other workers is very difficult to fulfill. This is not only about trying to do it better. This is about reporting it for workers that you have under your control, just for in some cases just for a very short period, which means that the rate will become a bit meaningless, and it could be more confusing than it would be clarifying. Thank you.
Kirsten, do you have specific language changes that you would like to propose, or is this a question of just airing your concerns, which you nevertheless are happy for the proposals to go out for public comment? I'd just like to capture whether there is something specific that you'd like to recommend the Standards Division do at this stage with the draft.
Yeah. When it comes to the definition, I would like the Standards Division to, or anybody else, to come up with a proper definition. I don't know a proper definition, but I'm airing that a proper definition is needed and that the current one is not clear enough. When it comes to either number or rate for occupational injuries, I would recommend that it should be either or. So that's language that I have already suggested for the Standards Department. When it comes to 403.4, my suggestion is that we keep it to employees only and delete workers, other workers. Thank you.
May I just respond, Judy?
Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
Yeah, so thank you, Kirsten. On your first point on formal committees, we do have some explanation within the guidance to that disclosure. So that is lines 348 till 351. So 348 till 351. We can work with the working group offline in the coming days to try and bring that up into a definition that we can include in the glossary. And if you have any specific wording suggestions, then yeah, we're happy to receive those and work offline with you. But that's definitely possible, and with the expertise we have in the working group, we can definitely come up with a good definition of formal committees. On your second point on requiring the rate or the number, I think that the challenge we had here with the working group is that there is no universally agreed methodology for calculating the rates. And although we are pushing for or being prescriptive about the ILO methodology, we acknowledge that other users might want to calculate these rates with their own methodologies, and that's why it's helpful to require the absolute data so that they can go ahead and calculate this with the methodology that they wish, but also acknowledging that there's currently very little transparency in how these rates are reported. Many times there is just the final rate being reported with no information as to how it has been calculated or what the numbers represent. And that's why the working group thought that it would be good to ask for both. and then developing some guidance to explain the usefulness of requiring both the rate and the number. But we're happy to bring this back to the working group for further feedback. And then on the last point on illnesses, just to clarify one point, and that is that the rate is not required for the illnesses. It's just the number for the same reasons that you mentioned, and the fact that some illnesses take a long time to detect, so the population of workers for which the rate is reported will vary, and it doesn't make much sense to require the rate. And then what we feel is that there was a strong desire within the working group to require this information for workers who are not employees, because in many industries that's where the biggest impact is. But then they also acknowledge that this is difficult, and that's why they decided to add this requirement to explain whether any workers have been excluded and why, to give the company an opportunity to explain why that data is not feasible to collect.
All right, thank you. Stian, would you like to raise a point?
Thanks, Judy. Chelsea and Laura, one thing that just came to my mind now is whether we checked against the SDGs, whether, and specifically SDG 3, whether we address the potential KPIs in this standard. And it's probably just a cross-reference that we need to do. Thanks.
Laura?
Thank you, Stian. We haven't done a thorough linkage at this stage, but the SDGs have been a key reference point throughout the development of this content. SDG 3 is perhaps the reason why we have this disclosure on worker health promotion, to acknowledge the rise of non-communicable diseases and the fact that many workers nowadays die not because of work-related accidents, but because of other non-work-related factors. So the SDGs have had a huge influence in the development of this content. But what we can do in the coming days is go back and do a more thorough linkage of the content we currently have with the different SDGs.
Okay. Are there any other comments, questions, suggestions that GSSB members would like to raise at the moment? Attila Yerlikaila has his hand raised. Attila, please go ahead.
Hi. It's about the promotion of health and well-being. I think we have to really put a very strong stress on the right to privacy here, because I mean, once the employees are start to be surveyed, categorized under certain programs, then it might also create a problematic area from an individual privacy standpoint, I believe. So how to better underline?
Okay, thank you. Laura, do you have a response on that?
Yes. If you look at item 03, starting in line 473, there are two reporting recommendations for companies to explain how they maintain the confidentiality of personal information related to workers' health, and how the company ensures that any personal information is not used for any discriminatory purposes against workers. So we have those two recommendations in at the moment. In the latest iteration of the draft, we have added a reference to the ILO Code of Practice on protecting workers' personal data. And we have this additional guidance element that we just mentioned on clearly stating that this program should respect workers' rights and should not become employment criteria or any criteria of any kind towards workers. And it's also mentioned in the background context to the standard. So yeah, please have a look and see if that would be sufficient. There's perhaps better ways of emphasizing this or elevating some of these recommendations into requirements. But yeah, please have a look and let us know if you would have any specific changes that you would like to propose to bring back to the working group.
Any other questions, comments, or recommendations?
Judy, it's Tian.
Yes.
Just to confirm what Laura said, the privacy issue was discussed in a lot of detail during the in-person meetings, and I'm happy that it is covered sufficiently in the proposed standard.
Thank you, Stian. Okay, we're doing very well for timing today. Thank you, everybody, for your concise and interesting questions and comments. Would you now let me know, Laura, are you satisfied with what you heard? Are there any further points that you would like to flag for the Standards Board? And may I also ask the Standards Board members to kindly now raise any final points on this particular topic?
So from our perspective, Judy, I think we've covered all of the points that we wanted to discuss with you today. So thank you very much for your input. And if there are any final thoughts, comments, suggestions for edits, please send those through by the end of the day tomorrow, and we will be working offline with you to implement those.
Thank you very much. Yes, just to reiterate, as for the previous discussion on water, any final edits, comments, suggestions, questions, please make sure you send them into the Standards Division by the end of the day tomorrow. Thank you very much. Okay, so our next item on the agenda is a brief update on the second set of standards review projects, which have to do with tax and payments to governments, the economic topics, and the human rights standards. Chelsea, would you like to tell us what's going on with those, please?
Judy, Bastian's actually going to present that section.
Yes. Hello, everyone. This is Bastian. So yes, this is about the projects that we've discussed in the last call. And what we owe you is an update on how we have been progressing those. I think I'm making these remarks also in light of the news that I've shared with you just last week, that Chelsea will leave the team and GRI in August, and therefore we have to reevaluate our capacity to deliver these projects according to timelines that we have shared with you earlier on. But what I'm sharing today is basically already acknowledging that reality, which is of course tough for us, as you can imagine. We want to continue to work on tax, and that has two main reasons. One is Chelsea has already done a lot of the background work together with Musarat on the team. So we are actually in the position to propose a technical committee for approval in the July call, and we see currently, for what we know, the capacity as sufficient to really start the process of developing contents this year, and that is in the fourth quarter of 2017. So we want to go ahead with that project. For human rights, it is a bit more, well, not only a bit, it is certainly a lot more involved in terms of the debate, also the upfront debate in terms of scoping human rights reporting against the realities that have emerged over the past years. We expect that this will be a longer project with more involvement also, but also a longer lead time to get the experts actually into the discussions. So here we are proposing to go ahead and actually also put a technical committee together and seek your approval in September and start the process this year. But basically the heavy investment by technical committee members, a number of hours, we will push that to early 2018. in particular the in-person meeting. We have signals already from likely interested individuals that we have identified that they would need advance notice for a commitment to the group, and so we want to make sure that they have the possibility to participate. We will, after your approval, then also look at scheduling the dates out for the next months, probably next half year to come already with the proposed members. But the bulk of the work will happen both in the team and for the experts early next year. For economic performance, we have done background research, but this is the one project, as we reflect in the last call also, that is more involved in terms of scoping that needs to be done here, also stakeholder engagement that we need to do to get the project off the ground and identify the right parties that actually have developed contents that can be supportive of the general direction that we have laid out in the project proposal. This takes more time, but also this is the project where we believe we probably have to postpone the actual implementation, and we're now currently in the planning looking at early 2018 for approval of a technical committee and getting that started. We're dealing, of course, with a couple of unknowns. We will be starting the process to hire a replacement for Chelsea. This won't be easy. This will take time, and we're currently handling an estimate of 6 to 7 months lead time starting now to have a new person in place. But then that's not really the date when you can start a project like economic performance, and in the next days we need also a bit of ramp-up time with a new person joining the team. We will keep you posted. I think in September, and when we meet in person, we will actually also have a better view on the budget allocation that GRI board has made to the GSSB, which will have an impact on the programming and also further hiring. And we can then discuss in particular the last item around economic performance and how we want to stage that in terms of timing at the September meeting. I leave it at that, but if there are any questions, please feel free to ask them now.
All right, board members, any questions about these brief updates on the phase 2 review projects? Hearing none, I think thank you very much for that update, Bastian, and we look forward to seeing the next steps in the coming weeks, as we know we will be. Okay, so that moves us on to any other business. We have one particular item on AOB, which is something that we didn't manage to get to on our last meeting, and that is the review of the technical queries that have been collected through the standards inbox. And we have a document. This is item 4 in your packet that was sent out prior to the meeting, and that logs all of the queries that have been received. Bastian, would you like to just take us through this very briefly, maybe highlight what the key takeaways are that you would like to either flag for the standards board or ask for some feedback on or make a recommendation around?
Well, I think when it comes to the feedback that we are receiving here, if I had to paraphrase it, it is more of the same. It is pointing in the same directions as earlier sets of feedback that we have received. We would not say at this point for discussions today to elevate one specific item as a discussion item, but we are evaluating as part of the monitoring program also first reports that are coming in based on the standards. And I think it is in combination with that we should be looking at a couple of the pointers that are coming through. So they're different. The different themes that we're seeing are still the same. Questions around assurance, questions about the in accordance criteria, and then materiality, of course. And we want to reconfirm that a bit through our monitoring work and looking at specific reports. But at this stage, it was really more the question to the GSB whether there was something in the feedback that you were reading where you say this needs immediate attention from our end. we don't have an element that we would want to elevate for discussion today.
Okay. All right. Good steer. Thank you very much. So for the Standards Board members, I would like to ask whether or not on your reading of this summary of technical queries, whether you see any particular cause for concern at the moment. We obviously must make sure that these queries inform our analysis of our work plan going forward, which of course we will be doing some more work on later on this in the coming months, and I know we will be having some discussion of it at our upcoming meeting. At the moment, are there any particularly strong ideas or themes that stand out to you, colleagues on the Standards Board? Would you like to see us fast-tracking any kind of particular response to these queries, or are you satisfied for us to do so during the normal course of events? As Bastian says, the themes, the feedback in particular, does not really diverge from those that we have been hearing since the release of the standards initially, which in one respect is gratifying because it suggests that the things which our users, our audiences are troubled by have not changed and have already clearly come to the surface. The question for us is really how we respond to them in the longer term, and whether we need to respond to them in any particular way in the short term. So any colleagues on the Standards Board who would like to comment on this or make a recommendation, please do so. Okay, hearing none. Thank you very much. And obviously we will, this is a standing agenda item for us on our meetings. So please, if you wouldn't mind just keeping an eye on this every month, and to the extent that any new comments or questions come to the fore, please be prepared to consider what you think the Standards Board might need to do in the short term. Thank you for that, Bastian. And we're still on any other business. Do we have any other items that have been raised, Bastian, that we need to discuss at the moment, or anything that you would like to add, or colleagues would like to add now?
Yes, we have one more item from the Secretariat, and we've put it on a slide as well, but I will describe it for those that are not on the webinar. We have received a first inquiry from a regulator, and specifically the Taiwan Stock Exchange. And they're inquiring with you, the board, about the implications of the effective date of the standards. So it has been communicated very clearly throughout the rollout, both with practitioners as well as the regulators, that as of 1st of July 2018, the GI standards will be effective, and that we will discontinue a G4 effective that date. The regulator is now contacting us saying the reality that they are facing is that they're working on a calendar year basis, and they have just recently, and that is last year, if I correctly recalling conversations I had with them, they've introduced a measure to require reporting, and as part of it, they have a strong recommendation to use the GI G4. And the next update for them would be the 1st of January 2019 to that regulation. And they're trying to balance regulatory costs as well as the compliance cost of the listed companies in Taiwan. And basically they're reaching out to the board to ask whether there are any reservations on your end about them postponing the adoption of the GI standards in Taiwan through their requirement to the 1st of January 2019. I think I should also explain that in Taiwan is an interesting case because it is a very strong a reference to GRI, and we see where it is estimated right now. I've recently been there that about 550 companies will report based on the GRI guidelines and standards combined this year. So we have very significant uptake there. It is mostly GRI G4 reporting. We see some there 3-4 weeks ago when I was there were about 75 GRI standards reports already. Probably more actually emerging in the next weeks. So we have already a reality where some companies have immediately moved to the GRI standards, and that's certainly encouraged and welcomed by the regulator, but they're saying we've put out a recommendation to use the GRI G4 specifically because the GRI standards were not in existence at the point, and by our schedule we will only look at then having the reference to the standards in 2019. My recommendation here from the standards division, and I've discussed that on earlier this week with Judy, is that going forward we likely see more of these type of inquiries, and I would propose that we at the Standards Division, together with the chair, will draw up individual responses to these inquiries along two main lines. One is that you, as the governance body that oversees the standards, will always have to determine an effective date of the standard itself. But that you're recognizing that regulatory schedules are often different, and you're trying actually over time to also be reflective of that reality. I think for the next round probably of discussing effective dates, we maybe should have discussions with regulators beforehand of what the right lead time would be or how we could coincide with their scheduling. But the reality is, and that's the second point, you are global. You have a global mandate. There are very many jurisdictions that either have some kind of regulation or recommendation in place nowadays. You're talking more than 60 countries and stock exchanges combined now. So you won't be able to always meet the expectations, realities of the individual regulator or policymaker. And therefore, we would set out in these letters that you welcome the initiatives to require or recommend the standards, and that you would leave it entirely to them to determine the schedule by when regulation and a reference to the standards becomes effective. So to basically detach the effective date of the standards as the GSSB sets them from the regulatory effective date. And I think what we see then is probably in some jurisdictions where you have a strong recommendation that the uptake is a bit more, well, stretched out over time, a bit slower maybe, but given the fact that you have generally very strong uptake in these countries and we want to be supportive of that general trend, that is probably acceptable. So in short, Judy will receive from us a draft that will go to specifically the Taiwan Stock Exchange now. We can share that also in the next meeting for your reference with all of you, and we will of course keep you in the loop if we have more inquiries of the nature of the one that we're looking at, but we want to keep also the administrative burden down and the communications channels open with the regulators. Do that through direct a link with Judy, and Judy and I, we have calls every second week, so we will be able to respond to these type of inquiries in a timely manner. Thank you.
Thanks, Bastian. My view is that this agreement with the Taiwan Stock Exchange that we're talking about here is a way of facilitating their support for GRI among Taiwan-listed companies, and simply because of it is a slight shift that doesn't actually, in my opinion, really have any impact on the timing of GRI standards reports in Taiwan. It simply acknowledges that this is an acceptable sort of divergence from the from what the GSSB has released as the effective date for the standards for reporting for use by reporters. Does anyone disagree with this position that we are planning to take or would like to offer an alternative. I see a few expressions of support in the chat function, which thank you very much. And there's a Nankumar Vadikapad has raised the issue that there's a number of companies in India who work on a fiscal year of the 1st of April to the 31st of March, and that it is therefore, and we know this to be the case, we know that it is likely that there will be interest in a number of different places around the world to be a bit flexible with the applicability dates. And I think we need to take these as they come, and as Kirsten says, to be flexible in the way that we respond to them. So if there are no objections to this way forward or any notes of caution, then I will be happy to share with you the letter that we plan to write to Mr. Cao at the Taiwan Stock Exchange, so that you can be aware of the way that we have framed the response to this, and obviously we will aim to be consistent in any other responses that we give to similar inquiries that we might receive in the future. Okay, well, if there's no further discussion of that, may I ask colleagues if you have any final any other business topics that you would like to raise at this point. We do have an unofficial closed session, administrative sort of session to come in a moment here. But if there's anything that we must conclude before we can close the public meeting, then please let us know now.
This is Bastian again. Just maybe one thing for the public record. I wanted to remind GSSB members about the email that went out this week from the governance team here to you, informing you about a date change for the next in-person meeting. So the meeting will be held on the 20th and 21st of September, as opposed to the 19th and 20th. So we're pushing it by one day. We have been in touch about this earlier on. It took a couple of days to actually finally confirm this, but it is confirmed now. So please have a look at your email. If there are any questions, feel free to be in touch with the governance team. If there are issues about rescheduling already booked flights or something like that, please let us know and we see how we can accommodate that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And for the record, that is entirely my fault. And I am grateful to the Standards Board and to the Secretariat and the Standards Division for allowing that shift to be made. Okay, well, with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their participation today, for your very valuable comments and contributions to the meeting. I'd like to once again thank the Standards Division and everyone who helps us with these meetings and helps us to implement our obligations as a standards board, and say that we look forward to speaking again at our July meeting. And thank you very much. With this, we will close the public meeting. Thank you.